Hello and welcome to Türkiye Talks. I'm joined by Kadir, Üstün and Kılıç, Buğra, Kanat, and we are going to talk about the crisis in Ukraine. There is an armed conflict going on, and we just entered the second week of the fighting. It seems that Russians have difficult times in Ukraine, and Ukrainians seem to determined to defend their cities. And the fighting has been focused around Kiev, but elsewhere we see a Russian military movement. Also, second round of talks are going on. We are going to talk about it. What kind of impact will this fighting have on international system, international security, world economy? The reaction of European Union, European countries, the United States, and of course the position of neighboring countries and also in our region. I want to start with Kadir, Üstün. Kadir, you've been following this crisis even before the fighting started. We talked about it a lot.
Yes.
Now we are in the second week of this fighting. How do you evaluate the latest situation? Many people waited a shorter conflict, but it seems that it's going to prolong. What is your opinion about it?
Bora, as you mentioned, we spoke about this a lot in a couple instances, and we said actually before the fighting started, the real scenario, the real picture was going to come after the invasion starts. Remember, there was unity among Western allies. There was strong rhetoric against Russia about sanctions, threats, economic threats. And we discussed, if you remember, whether the West would be able to impose those and whether that would deter Putin. And we've seen, to the surprise of the world community, I think, to the surprise of many people, that the West actually was able to unite around the sanctions, impose really serious sanctions, isolate Russia economically, go after Putin, oligarchs. There are so many. I mean, Chelsea's president pulled out of, like he's selling his shares of Chelsea. Like that's just symbolic. So there's a lot of pressure on Putin and people around him, Russia. And then right now, the last big piece seems that if the West stops getting any natural gas or oil from Russia, that would really be like full-on blockade of Russia at every level. So the pressure has been immense by the West. Has this deterred Putin? No. So far, he's determined. He's taking his time. He's not rushing, but he seems ready to give a lot of losses. We were just discussing earlier. There are probably several thousand soldiers Russian soldiers who left their lives, who lost their lives already. It's a big loss within a matter of 2 weeks now, and these major cities are still in the hands of the Ukrainians, and Ukrainians seem determined that they're going to fight. I expect Putin to eventually take control of Kiev one way or another. He's going to take his time, because otherwise he's already, met all these costs. He probably thinks, what is there to lose? I have to emerge out of this victorious. I have to get control of Kiev. But at what cost, right? So the cost is high, but he's determined. So the West hasn't been able to deter Putin, but has been able to impose immense costs on Russia. What's going to happen after this? It's a big question. Are we basically on the cusp of a new Cold War? Remember, initially we thought maybe there would be a scenario where Putin would be content with taking Donbas region and wait maybe a couple years and then try to do more later. But it seems like that's not his plan. He wants to take care of this once and for all at whatever the high cost. And this has raised big questions about Putin's mental health in the West. At least this is, of course, we are witnessing a lot of information wars, and the West seems to be, at least in the eyes of the international community, winning on that front. How the war is framed, how Putin is framed. But at the end of the day, Putin has the hard power, and he is determined to take over Kiev, and no matter how long it takes. That's his position, it seems. And all these efforts in trying to broker a peace deal, or at least a ceasefire right now, they all seem premature, and he's not really listening to that. So, of course, there's a nuclear question. We can maybe, I don't want to take too long, of a time to go into all the details of this, but of course that would be one hell of a development if he actually reached and tried to use nuclear weapons, because we didn't think, maybe the world community didn't think that Putin would go and invade Ukraine fully like this, and he did. And now he's threatening nukes. I am worried about that, but hopefully he won't use that. So I'll just stop here.
This attack also showed, even in the modern times, you have to take weather conditions into consideration. You have to still watch your logistical lines. We have seen Russian army have difficult times because of mud. This is also something many I think soldiers, military strategies has to take into account. Otherwise, the easiest way, putting your nukes into equation and try to deter the other side. Kılıç, what is your take on that?
I think
we are in the second week of the.
I want to just add a few points that you made earlier about the conventional warfare that is taking place. I think it is important to understand that what we are facing right now is a hybrid warfare. And right now we are seeing that Russia is literally using every means that is available in their toolbox, right? There is a cyber warfare dimension of it. There were cyber attacks to the critical infrastructure of Ukraine and Ukrainian TV stations, websites, government agencies, websites, etc. There's an information warfare that is both sides actually trying to use. At the same time, there is this irregular dimension of this. There was concern about a rising militia in the east that was under the control of Russia for the last few years, but also the entrance of groups like Wagner Group, private security firms to the war. And on top of that, there is this conventional dimension that two countries are fighting a really ferocious warfare. So it becomes really difficult to analyze, because we have not seen the usage of all of these instruments in one single warfare for the last 20, 30 years, right? So our idea of warfare, our idea of battles are changing, and this is probably it will be one of the critical junctures in the military history. And secondly, it's important to understand that 2 weeks ago, it has been now the second week of the war, but 2 weeks ago, we weren't expecting many things. Not many people were expecting Putin to invade Ukraine. They were thinking that Putin has always been a person in full control. He will probably not engage in such an adventurous act when the world is trying to deal with COVID, when Russia is involved in Syria. So they weren't thinking that. Second, not many people were expecting United States and European allies to join forces, unite and react to Russia in the same level, in the same frequency. And not many people were expecting Ukrainians to organize such a resistance, at least in the first week of the war. So these three things that many people were not expecting.
And strong defiance of the president of
course,
Ukraine.
it was a big moral boost, of course, for many Ukrainians. I guess it played a significant role. So after these three things that nobody was expecting, now we are entering the second week of the war, and now we have a different setting. And now we are expecting certain things, and those things are not things that we can be. Some of them are not making us very optimistic about the future. Number one, we see that Putin changed its military strategy. So instead of amassing a huge army and expecting Ukrainians to flee and expecting the government to leave Kiev, now he is going back to his default settings. Those default settings that he used, some of them in Grozny in Chechnya in 1990s and early 2000s, and some of them that he used in Syria, right? Heavy bombardment, scaring people, and not expecting them to flee, but forcefully depopulating the areas. So I think when Putin is expecting, today I was looking at the numbers, the number of Ukrainian refugees reached to 1 million to neighboring countries. I think it is showing that Putin's strategy is at this point working in default settings. People are leaving, and he's expecting many to live in major cities. Secondly, the sanctions and the timing of the sanctions and the type of the sanctions that were adopted by European Union and United States demonstrate that the transatlantic alliance, at least the alliance against Russia between United States and Europe, may prolong, right? This may not be something that will, it is not an ad hoc coalition, because we started to see that for the Madrid conference in May, NATO will be probably the most significant issue will be again Russia. And it will be a change in the strategy. And even if the war ended in Ukraine, even if there is a ceasefire today, I think the sanctions will continue to influence the Russian economy. And number three, for the Ukrainians, of course, this heavy warfare, unfortunately, the number of casualties will increase. And we have not received a really credible report right now about the casualties, but the heavy bombardment that we are seeing that has been taking place in the bordering regions and now today in Kiev demonstrate that there may be unfortunately some civilian casualties and their numbers may increase. So we will see yet another major humanitarian tragedy. On the one hand, we will see the refugees in the border areas. Secondly, we will see a lot of internally displaced people leaving Kiev and trying to go to the border regions. And those who prefer to stay, and we will see their tragedy. This is a tragedy that in Turkey, in different parts of region, from Syria to Iraq, from Karabakh to now Ukraine, we have witnessed for the last 20 years. And unfortunately, it will continue to, at this point, it looks like it will continue to be present there.
When you were talking about the sanctions, it came to my mind the question of Russian reaction. I mean, people in Russia, they are going to be the ones who will suffer because of these sanctions. These monetary issues, the closure of Russia. Also these casualties, it will have probably a psychological impact on Russian people as well. I wonder if this can be destabilizing Russian government, or how much they can tolerate this situation, how much Putin can tolerate, can stand, because we know that he got great support from Russian people for the last 20 years. When we look at 1990s, Russia was in a great economic turmoil, political problems. So when Putin took over, he solved many issues within Russia. he used the revenue from natural gas, so he stabilized the economy. We know the economy came to a better position. Russian stand in international politics became stronger, so he has credibility in the eyes of Russian people. Do you think this may be affected from this war, or he can handle this situation? Because I believe that as long as the war continues, it can have negative effect in Russia, and maybe he may review his position. I don't know. Would you agree with that?
Well, one of the things that people didn't expect, we've been talking about things we didn't expect, was that the sanctions would also general public and general Russian economy. We didn't really expect that. And right now, there's so much sort of divestment from Russia. They're suspended from European and the World Cup and like all sports organizations and all sorts of things that are, civilian stuff. So we were thinking that they would target Putin and maybe oligarchs around him, but he had enough cash, he could survive it, etc. But today, the picture is very different. Like you said, it's impacting actual Russian people. They're running to banks, trying to take out rubles. Rubles value is, depreciated immensely. So there is a big pressure on the people, and they're demonstrating and they're being arrested on the streets in the thousands. So basically, West has chosen a strategy to maybe force regime change eventually, right? Like Russian people are being forced to confront Putin himself. So this is a different dynamic, and when you're being forced towards this, right? Putin's biggest complaint about the West in the last 20 years is like, oh, they always want to engineer regime change in countries that are, formerly Soviet countries, and now it's happening in his own country. So that's why I expressed my worry earlier. This will make him even more sort of aggressive and security-minded, and he's not gonna, easily bow down to that pressure, and that creates a combustible situation. He has the nukes in his hands. He has the, power of the state in his hand. And then he has a lot of cash, so the Russian people are still dependent on him to change course here, right? So if they can't make him change course, what is going to happen? So I'm worried about that. The impact of the sanctions on actual Russian people, civilians, is very significant, in my opinion. You're right to point that out as a significant development. I don't think Putin is going to just give up because there are demonstrations in the streets.
Can I add a point for this? When Crimea was annexed in 2014, we see a sharp hike in the popularity of Putin. So when we see the approval ratings, if we can call it, to Putin, it has been always more than 50% around, and of course when Crimea happened, there was a sharp rise in his popularity. I'm not sure if it's going to happen this time. I don't see, at least, of course, we are aware that we are in the midst of an information warfare. So we are not sure if we are seeing the real pictures in Moscow, but it is important to see that I didn't see major demonstration in support of this invasion. I didn't see people cheering up that much. And I didn't still see a public opinion poll that shows Russians are supporting invading Ukraine and killing Ukrainians. And it's important to understand that the annexation of Crimea was rather bloodless, right? And it was really smooth. Yeah. It was quick. It was a decisive victory. So I think there is an issue. Secondly, in sanctions, the governments can, it depends on of course, the capability of the government to control the information, of course, but up to a certain point, when sanctions started to hurt ordinary people, the government can, through its media, can blame others, foreigners, for this. It can be Europeans, it can be Americans, but it has a boomerang effect. At certain point, people may turn and try to understand what really caused these sanctions. Because it is extremely demoralizing to see the sustenance of this sanctions every day, like multiple different sanctions. You see that, for example, a country is shutting down its airspace to Russia. Every day, couple countries. Every day, couple countries are trying to kick off some Russian institution from their country. And FIFA, Eurovision, things that Russians feel very connected to the Europe are being shut down right now. And these are extremely demoralizing. And thirdly, I think it's important to understand, we have to touch upon the intelligence level of this. So I think the US intelligence, when US intelligence announced that Putin may invade Ukraine, everybody was taking this with a grain of salt. Because US intelligence failed multiple times so far, right? Yeah. And each and every time they find an excuse, but there was constant failure. And there was constant, like the feeling that in cyber attacks, U.S. intelligence was compromised, U.S. institutions were compromised. But this time, the U.S. intelligence was right. It has one dimension for the Western countries that U.S. intelligence is right now. It is much more reliable according to, for example, U.S. government and European Union. But we have to see the dimension from the Russians as well. Putin, who has been a spy master before becoming a politician and president, I think his strongest side was considered as intelligence and intelligence operations, right? 2016, the debate about 2016 election meddling, interference to the elections, the assassination of some political dissent from different intelligence agencies. All of them were part of, at least in the same, it was interpreted within the same line that it was Putin. It was his tactical, his tactical genius is, like the making him do this. But now I think US intelligence through media really trolled him for at least a month, right? Telling that Russia is planning to invade on Wednesday. No, now it's on Saturday, right? Think about a person who felt most confident about his intelligence skill, how he would feel, and how Russian would feel about him. Yeah. To give that major intelligence leak. Russians reading their country's military operation from the Western outlets. And I think this will also generate major discussion, and it will impact state-society relation at least.
Yeah, you can continue. I'll add something to this.
Just wanted to add one thing. That's why there's a lot of discussion about this is really, like this may have sort of destabilized Putin himself.
This is, I was going to go further. You said US intelligence was right, so everybody was expecting this. But before the war, before this fighting, we have not seen a very strong counter activity from the Western side, from NATO. So it brings the question, was it neglecting Russia, or was it ignorance, lack of strategic preparation, or was it a trap to Russia?
I think it was partly underestimating Putin. I think it was partly the years of wrong or mistaken intelligence, like Iraqi nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction. So when actually US intelligence started to leak this, everybody, those who are very skeptical about US foreign policy and its objectives, started to raise Iraq war as an example, right? Saddam Hussein at that point was US intelligence basically said he has a weapons of mass destruction. So they were saying that, well, US is playing the same game, intelligence is wrong. But turned out that It was right.
What is your?
Well, I have a bit of a different take on this because we are NATO. I mean, Biden announced the Western strategy, right? We are going to exact huge costs on you, and they were quite open about it. And then we will not fight Russia, right? That they were open, and then, you know, they said they will reinforce forces in NATO countries, which they did. So in many ways, you're right. If they had this intelligence, why didn't they try to confront them? But the policy was, intelligence is showing that he will invade, right? But the policy is, we will not fight them, and then we will make it costly for him. We are going to reassure our allies, and then we are going to support Ukraine. So far, they've done all those things, right? There's NATO deployments to Poland, Germany, elsewhere, and then there's support to Ukraine. There is, you know, arms support, not just, you know, rhetorical support. So I think this time around, intelligence, like Kılıç said, we took it like, well, maybe Putin will just be happy if he gets a chunk and he will manage the international reaction. But like we said, if they foiled his plan, he may have just said, okay, you know what, I'll just do it. And he became more aggressive because of that. And so in many ways, US administration, the West, is doing what they said they would, but in a much stronger, much more comprehensive way. I thought literally that they would sanction Putin, oligarchs, but it wouldn't have much of an impact, and then Putin will eventually get what he wants. That's how I was thinking, to be honest.
I had a feeling, you know,
yeah.
the West has spared Ukraine as a buffer zone where Russia would spend its energy, consume its sources, consume its credibility, then Putin would be in a position to be handled easier than he was before this attack to Ukraine.
Just to add, you know, like it's true that they didn't look very prepared, at least United States and European Union, to the Russian invasion. But at the same time, don't you think they look too prepared? Don't you think that those sanctions are too quick? Right? SWIFT was too swift of a sanction, right? Everybody was expecting, and the way that Germany reacted, right? Because it's amazing. Scholz was in Washington a week before the invasion, and in the press conference in White House, multiple journalists asked him about Nord Stream 2, and he didn't respond. And journalists started to ask Biden if Germany was a reliable ally. That was Germany a week ago.
Yeah.
So in a week time, I don't think, yes, it wasn't unexpected, but look, in the first week of the military strikes of Russia was not that destructive. So if those sanctions came this week, we could say that, okay, they weren't prepared, and right now, in a week time, they coordinated. But having those sanctions in 1 or 2 days, streamlining the reaction one by one, from the airspace to SWIFT to sanctions to oligarchs, everything. I think there was a preparation. At least I think there was a scenario. I think there was a simulation.
Absolutely.
That, you know, like they kind of, you know, like prepared for this. And we don't know how much weapons they gave to, of course, Ukraine so far, right? So when I look at this complex set of variables, I can see that now. Today, New York Times was reporting that actually Beijing asked Russia not to invade Ukraine until the end of Olympics, right? So now U.S. intelligence is leaking that as well. If it is credible, right, it shows that U.S. was at least this bargain, at least the bargain of Olympics between Russia and China earlier.
Let me just add something quick. U.S., in my opinion, like you said, was prepared for these specific things. Even imagine this, right? Switzerland decided to line up with the sanctions. And imposing pressure on Switzerland is not an easy thing. So I think behind the scenes, US coordinated a lot of this, but they didn't want to make it look like US versus Russia, because this would help Putin's propaganda. And then the other thing is that, they didn't want to get into a direct confrontation with Russia, but this doesn't mean that US was not doing a lot behind the scenes. I think that's what you're describing, and I think that's what happened as well.
I think another point about this is, remember, for the last couple of days, especially after Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia, it's important to understand that when after Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia tweeted Mersheimer's quote saying that we have to blame the expansion of NATO for the invasion of Crimea, annexation of Crimea, everybody was going back and re-questioning whether NATO expansion was a good thing. Because even Putin was mentioning in his speech, right, that long speech, that the US promised actually not to expand NATO, but then the expansion happened very quickly. So I think any attempt by US in regards to potential steps they would take in case of an invasion of Ukraine might be considered as provocative by Russia. And after a couple of years, they would again blame United States, saying that, well, US provoked Russia. I think US know about that, and I think by leaking intelligence while provoking, they try not to seem to be too provocative.
Very interesting analysis. We are going to close the show, our program, but before closing, let's quickly look at the region. I think this fighting this conflict had impact on basically on European affairs, Eastern European security, Black Sea region. So as part of this region, Turkey has also interest in having a ceasefire or end of this armed conflict. Isn't it this situation? Like everybody, Turkey also needs a quiet in this region.
Bora, of course, like we can analyze the situation and we can, discuss these issues, but at the end of the day, we mentioned it also. This is a huge humanitarian tragedy. It's already exceeded 1 million refugees. We know, as Turkey, we know this experience really well. It's a huge human cost, and it will create destabilization in the region, not just in Ukraine, but it already has done it in Eastern Europe. And if eventually Putin, one way or another, takes over Ukraine, then countries in the Western Balkans are going to be really worried. People are, the countries in Baltic are already worried. So this will not stay in Ukraine. We know that by now. And Turkey is obviously very, very worried about that. Every conflict over the past 30 years, Times of Turkey had a great map showing all that, right? Pretty much every country has been embroiled in some sort of conflict in the last 30 years, and this is continuing, and it has consequences for Turkey. Both countries, Russia and Ukraine, are important trade partners for Turkey, and this is worrisome. That's why, and its security situation is deteriorating by the day. So this gives an immense sort of incentive for Turkey to try to broker a deal. And Turkey is trying to do that every day, literally. But the logic of war, I think, makes it kind of too premature for either side to say, okay, enough, we need to get to an agreement. And, we are heading to summer, the tourism season is going to be impacted by this. So it is a difficult place for Turkey to be honest. The US has more the luxury, the financial luxury to, impose these economic costs on Russia, but Turkey doesn't. At the same time, Turkey supports Ukraine very strongly, their territorial integrity, etc. So it's a tough situation, tough neighborhood for Turkey, to be honest.
Yeah. That's why Turkey has invested in national defense industry so much, and I think
Yeah.
this fighting in Ukraine proved that Turkey is right. So if you don't have anything to add, with this we came to the end of this edition of Türkiye Talks. We talked about the crisis in Ukraine with Kadir Üstün, Kılıç, Buğra, Kanat, and myself, Bora Bayraktar. Hope to see you next time. Have a nice time.